Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In our last video, we did a deep dive into the spool weight of a bait casting reel. In today's video, we will be focusing on another key parameter of a spool which has been overlooked for years. Let's start by taking a look at Daiwa's newest flagship reel, the 2024 Steez. Here is its official website. In the spec table, this column is called the line recovery, or known as inch per ton IPT by a lot of North American anglers. This number is supposed to tell you how much line your reel can retrieve every time you turn the handle once. For Steez, there are 3 gear ratios, and you can see there are 3 IPT numbers accordingly. And indeed, the IPT numbers is directly associated with the gear ratio. The higher the gear ratio, the higher IPT. So in my hand is a 8.5 to 1 extra high gear ratio 24 Steez, which I have done the initial review on my other channel. According to Daiwa, the line recovery should be 85 centimeters or 34 inches per turn. Now, instead of just taking Daiwa's numbers, let's actually do a measurement and see if Daiwa's numbers are accurate or not. I have my Steez already mounted on the rod grip, and I'm ready to spool it with 15-pound Tester Power Pro Super 8 Slick version 2 braided line. The line is coming off of the spool through a line counter, then into the spool of the Steez. The line counter will be set to 0 first. Then as I spool, I want you to count with me how many turns I did before I stop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now let's see the line counter. It's 985, so 1000 minus 985 is 15 feet. 15 feet divided by 8 equals 1.88 feet, which equals to 22.5 inches per ton. Now wait a minute. This IPT number is much smaller than the official results of the 34 inches per ton Daiwa listed on the website. So is Daiwa lying? To answer this question, we need to dive into today's topic, the spool diameter. Now there are 2 diameters of the spool that we fishermen should be aware of. The inner diameter, which is the diameter of the inner cylinder where we wind our fishing line onto. Then the outer diameter, which is the diameter of the spool rim. The inner diameter defines how deep the spool is. The outer diameter limits how much line we can put on a specific spool. But wait, this is an empty spool. My question to you again is, in the real world, who fishes with an empty spool? I do! For those elusive space bears are scared away by the slightest perturbation of your inner peace. You need to focus and rely 120% on your spiritual power. The key is to never use any fishing line. Thus, your inner peace shall never be destroyed by a f***ing backlash. From our last episode, we know the moment we put line on the spool weight changes. And similarly, the moment we put line on the spool, the actual inner diameter also changes. The actual inner diameter is the empty spool's inner diameter plus the diameter our fishing line brings in. This is probably one of the most important but also most overlooked parameter we fishermen should be aware of. And here is why. When talking about motion, for instance a car, we often use velocity to measure how fast the car moves. So this is the linear system, so the velocity of the car is actually a linear velocity. In the world of a baitcaster spool, or more generally in the rotational system, there are 2 speeds, the angular velocity and the linear velocity. The angular velocity is how many degrees the spool turns in 1 second, or more commonly described as RPM. It's describing how many revolutions it goes through in 1 minute. The linear velocity of a spool, however, is affected by how far the point of interest is away from the rotation axis, as well as the angular velocity. Its relation with the angular velocity is defined by V equals omega times R. where r is the distance of the point of interest to the rotational axis. The larger the r, the larger the linear velocity are by maintaining a constant angular velocity. When we put line on a spool, the effective inner radius becomes the r here. This means if two spools with different effective inner radius is rotating at the same angular velocity or RPM, the linear speed and the effective inner radius are actually different. When the spools are retrieving line at the same RPM, the amount of line being winded onto the two spools are different in a given period. The larger the effective inner radius, the more line you are recovering. This is easy to understand because when retrieving, the length of the line approximately equals to the circumference of the cylinder the line was wrapped on, and the circumference of the cylinder equals 2 pi times r. Now going back to our IPT question, did Daiwa lie to us about their IPT of the Steez? In fact, the IPT is the spool circumference times gear ratio. So the gear ratio is how many revolutions the spool turns when you turn the handle once. But actually, almost all the IPT numbers seen on all the real manufacturer specs are the maximum IPT numbers, which means when a spool is absolutely full, you will get that IPT number. Many manufacturers like Shimano call it max IPT, while some, including Daiwa, simply call it IPT. Please keep in mind, this is not an average number, it is the maximum value. So here comes the reality. So the IPT of a spool which has little line on it can vary drastically compared to its max IPT. Using our 24 Steez as an example, just now when you guys were helping me counting how many revolutions I turned the handle while putting line on the spool was empty. And at that time, the IPT equals gear ratio times 2 pi r, where r is the inner radius of the empty spool in this case. So the 24 Steez spool's inner radius measures about 1 centimeter. Thus, the amount of line recovered by every handle turn when we did that was 8.5 times 2 pi times the radius equals 56 centimeters. This is our calculated number. We turned the handle 8 times, so the line retrieved at the beginning of this video by calculation should be 4.4 meters or about 15 feet. And we measured 15 feet, so our measured line length matches precisely with the calculated length. If you compare this number to the IPT Daiwa listed, there is roughly a 30% difference. In our last episode, we talked about how spool's actual weight varies during a casting or retrieving. Just like the spool weight, during a cast or retrieving, the spool's effective radius changes with the line amount that is on the spool at the moment. In turn, the IPT also changes. When we are casting, line peels off the spool, the actual radius decreases. When retrieving, line got winded onto the spool, the actual radius increases. This affects our lure presentation and casting significantly. Let's take a closer look. First and foremost, this constantly changing spool radius affects the lure speed during presentation. Again, let's remember, V equals omega times R. When we are retrieving the lure, the speed of the lure is what we really care about. And this speed is the linear speed of the lure, which equals the linear speed of a particle at the outer side of the spool. Hence, equals to the spool angular velocity times the effective radius of the spool at that moment. So the spool angular velocity is the omega here. It is how quick the spool turns, which is proportional to how quickly you turn the handle. R is the spool effective radius. How does it impact lure presentation? Say you are throwing a square bill. Once the bait hits water, you engage the reel and start to crank the handle. The initial IPT is actually the lowest during this entire retrieve, because the amount of line that's left on the spool is the least at the beginning of the retrieve. When the bait is closer to the boat, when you have the last couple of cranks, the IPT is the highest because most of the line is now on the spool and the spool's actual radius is the largest. This means even if you crank the handle at a constant speed, which is the angular speed to be specific, or RPM, the lure is not going to stay at a constant swimming speed. The lure speed will increase as it gets closer to the angular. Now this is super important when it comes to lure presentation. For instance, when throwing crankbaits, we know at certain times fish will like it fast. So you need to be aware that if you want the bait to go fast all the way, then at the beginning of your retrieval, you need to crank the handle faster to compensate for the lost IPT due to the smaller spool radius. This way, you are really making the crankbait go fast all the way. Other examples would include buzzbait and chatterbait. The quicker their blades start turning or vibrating, the better chance they will get bit or stay free from snags, etc. So again, you might need to turn the handle quicker when you start retrieving if you want them to start right away. On the other hand, if you want to keep baits like spy bait or swim baits down deep in the water column, you need to be aware that the entire retrieving process is a process of acceleration. So you need to slow down your handle cranking RPM as the bait gets closer, or even completely stop every once in a while, let it fall a bit, then start cranking the handle again. This way will keep your bait at certain depths instead of coming up shallow prematurely due to the increasing IPT and retrieving speed, even if you keep the handle turning at the same RPM. Because of the same reason, you have probably already noticed that for the moving baits, the lure speed is actually dependent on how far you cast as well. The longer the cast, the slower the initial speed. Say you're running the boat parallel to the bank and you keep doing those like 30 feet roll casts to beat the bank with a buzzbait, right? Okay, and all of a sudden you notice a standing timber, like 90 feet in front of a boat, say. You made a bombing cast to hit that spot. Now the initial speed of this 90 feet cast is going to be slower than the 30 feet roll cast you were making, because the initial actual spool radius is going to be smaller than the 30 feet casts. Now if you want to keep the speed of a buzzbait, you need to realize the difference and crank the handle a little bit faster than you were with the 30 feet casts. For deep diving crankbaits, long bombing cast is usually needed so as to let the bait hit the max steps. A longer cast also makes the bait to dive more slowly initially than a shorter cast due to the smaller initial actual spool diameter, which is beneficial for reaching max depths in a lot of cases. This smaller spool diameter works together with the casting distance to perfect the deep diving crankbait in this case. As you retrieve, you will, however, notice the increasing resistance from the deep crankbait because its speed is increasing as well as the torque it has on the spool, both caused by increasing spool diameter. When you feel much more resistance, you can actually tune down your handle turning speed just a little bit, knowing this will keep the bait in the water column longer, maintain the speed, as well as reduce some fatigue of your turning hand. The actual spool diameter also affects how fast we can retrieve. This is huge for fighting fish in cover. Using flipping as an example, we hear a lot of talk such as, oh, we need a high gear or extra high gear reel for this because the high gear helps us to quickly pick up the slack and set the hook, also enables us to quickly pull the fish out of the cover. On the other hand, flipping does not need a lot of line at all, as most of it is close quarter fight, which I personally love, by the way. So a lot of guys would only put like 25 to 30 yards of line on a deep spool. Now that we've talked about actual diameter and IPT, we should know in this case the gear ratio is far from the whole picture. What we should really focus on is the actual IPT, not just the reel's gear ratio. As we discussed a moment ago, IPT equals gear ratio times 2 pi times actual spool radius. If you really want the highest actual IPT you can get out of the reel, then you need a large actual diameter of the spool, plus the high gear. Now let's take a look at this 2018 model of the Shimano Bantam XG, for example. The empty spool diameter is 17 millimeters. And after putting 30 yards of 17-pound test fluorocarbon on it, the actual diameter becomes 21 millimeters. With the gear ratio of 8.1 to 1, the actual IPT is 21 inches or 53 centimeters. Now, if I take an 18-year model with Shimano Bantam, which is the same model as the XG, but with a gear ratio of 6.2 to 1, and spool it all the way to full capacity, the actual diameter is 30 millimeters, and your actual IPT is 23 inches or 58 centimeters. So you can see the results on the screen now. Although you are using a XG 821 reel, the actual retrieve speed is actually slower than that of the low gear ratio reel. It's almost like buying a Lamborghini for daily commute in the San Diego traffic. Yes, it is a supercar, but used as a Prius. So why pay the extra money? Now back to the topic. If you really want to utilize the extra high gear ratio's benefit of offering a high IPT in flipping, you need to still fill the spool all the way to the top. Even though flipping does not need a lot of line, but you do need the actual spool diameter. Again, you can put backing on the spool first to reduce the waste of fresh line. So backing not only reduces spool weight in the cases of fluorocarbon line, but also increases the spool diameter to some extent. In both ways, backing is acting like a makeshift shadow spool. And similarly, it is also important to hook setting when using slow rigs, such as a Carolina rig. Typically at the end of a super long cast, your reel won't be able to pick up slack as quickly as if for those closer casts. So for C-rig reels, I prefer those with extra high gear ratio and larger spool diameters. And of course, I fill them all the way up. Another interesting point about the constantly changing spool radius is how fast the actual radius changes is actually dependent on the line diameter as well. The thicker the line, the faster the actual radius increases during the retrieval, and vice versa. Thicker line will have a much higher range for spool radius change than using thin line. The spool actual radius simply becomes smaller than that of the thin line spool after a long cast. Thicker line will also have a bigger impact on the spool weight variation in a cast. So all these will be discussed in detail in our later videos. Now, a lot of folks like to estimate the casting distance by counting the number of turns of a handle. First of all, I want to say any distance results without actual measurement is subject to huge error bar. Second, when estimating by counting handle turns, we need to remember the constantly changing diameter of our spool. You simply cannot use the number of handle turn times the IPT number listed by the manufacturer to estimate. Now going back to the 24 Steez as an example, the IPT of 85 centimeters or 34 inches of the 8.5 to 1 model is the max IPT. This number itself is unrealistic as well, because this number is when you fill the spool all the way to the very edge of the rim of the spool. In reality, no one does that. We always leave 1 to 2 millimeters to the edge. So we can never reach 85 centimeter or 34 inches per turn. And the average IPT depends on how low the spool radius go for each specific cast. The longer the cast, the lower the average IPT. If you hear someone telling you that he casted a plug 91 meters using a number 1.5 braided line on the Steez 24 8.5 because he measured 108 turns of handle and 108 times 85 equals 91, please smile back and tell him to watch this video. In fact, the actual amount he had on the spool is only around 72 to 75 meters. By the way, the correlation between the spool diameter and the lure presentation is also applicable to the spinning reels. The spool diameter affects the casting performance as well, just like the spool weight. But I ran out of time today, so I will leave this for our next videos. But here's an homework for you. So I'm putting fluorocarbon line on two identical empty spools. One was 8-pound test, the other is 10-pound test. I counted 70 handle turns on both, and neither of the spool was full at the moment. Now the question is, which spool has a larger diameter? Did I put equal length of line on both spools? And if not, which one has a longer line and why? And what can you think of with regard to the spool weight we discussed in our last video? Now let me know your answer. This type of video is trying to get you a different angle to look at our tackle. There is a lot of discoveries to be made as long as you're willing to dig a little bit. And I'm sure it will help you to release the full potential of your tackle to catch more fish. So that's it for today. Tight lines until next time. Inner peace.